Man, thank you all for that time of worship. Now, think about the lyrics that we sang together over and over. Forever he is glorified, forever he is lifted high, and forever he is risen. He is alive, he is alive. How much should that really affect our lives? Right? If we really believe that he is lifted high, that he is glorified, and it's not just now, it wasn't just in his earthly ministry, but forever. Forever. That should determine so much of our lives today, and it should also give us a trajectory for the future and how we have hope and how we hold on to the grace of God, knowing that he is forever glorified, that he is risen, and that he is alive. You know, I think this plays in a great way to the sermon this morning. When we think about forever, that is a statement of the future, right? It is a statement of looking down, if we could, the corridors of time. And one thing will be absolutely true, that he will be alive and that he will be glorified. Our society, in particular the church, but our society as a whole, we are fascinated with the future. There are movies about the future, many, many movies. In fact, the highest grossing movie of all time is the movie Avatar, which is this kind of dystopian future view of what could happen in the future of Earth and other planets and so on. There are books written about the future. I remember as a kid asking questions about the future, and the same rings true with my children, oftentimes asking questions about the future. What will it be like when I'm grown up? What will it be like when we're in the new heavens and the new earth? My son Owen often asks questions when he gets a really good idea of the way things ought to be. He'll ask me, in the new world, will it be like this? Wondering what the future might be like. In fact, even in the academic world, there are specialty sciences, the cosmological studies of eschatology. Basically, science trying to figure out what's going to happen with the universe. What does the end look like? These studies in eschatology, which is just a big word that means a study of the end. And of course, in the Christian bookstores, you'll find that many, many books, fiction books, that have made millions and millions of dollars, giving us an idea of what the future might be like, such as the Left Behind books or the movies that were made after the books. Again, we have this fascination with the future. And that's not odd. In fact, I think that's how God has designed us. He has designed us as people who long for and hope for something. Right? Adam and Eve was given a promise. The first man and woman created, they were given a promise so that they had something to look forward to in the future. And constantly, we see the scriptures moving toward this great end. What will the future hold? And we're not the only ones. I think the disciples likewise had a curiosity about the future. They likewise wanted to know, what is the future going to be like? What is it all about? And in fact, they asked Jesus this question. So if you would, turn with me to Mark chapter 13. We're going to be in the first 13 verses this morning, but we'll start with verses 1 through 4. This is what has been known or come to be known as the Olivet Discourse. Mark 13, chapter 13, verse 1. And as he came out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what wonderful stones and what wonderful buildings." And Jesus said to him, "Do you see these great buildings? There will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." And as he sat on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, Peter and James and John and Andrew asked him privately, here's the question, right? "Tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign when all these things are about to be accomplished?" So here the disciples hear Jesus' words about the temple, and that gets them thinking. So when they leave the temple and they go to the Mount of Olives, and now they're sitting on the Mount of Olives looking at the temple, they come up to him and ask him, when will these things take place? What will be the signs? So really what they're asking is, what is the fate of the temple? What's the fate of the temples? The disciples heard Jesus say that the temple would be overthrown, that it would be torn down, and now they are truly curious about the fate of the temple. We looked a few weeks ago about the story of Jesus walking into the temple after the triumphal entry. He looks around and then he walks out and he curses the fig tree, and then he comes back into the temple. And what does he do? He turns the tables over. And in a symbolic parable, or an enacted parable, Jesus predicts the destruction of the temple. He then leaves the temple, and they come to the fig tree, and that fig tree is now withered, thus being in parallel with the temple. As the fig tree withers, so will the temple wither. And now Jesus and his disciples are walking out of the temple for the last time, and Jesus tells them again, it's all coming down. This thing will be destroyed. So let's start in verse 1. It says, and as he came out of the temple, one of the disciples said to him, look, teacher, what wonderful stones and what wonderful buildings. That first phrase I think is very interesting. And as he came out of the temple. Now, Jesus, since he came into Jerusalem, remember, we are in the last week of Jesus' life. Since the triumphal entry, all the way through the crucifixion, this is 1 week in his life. And most of this week has been spent in the temple. He's been teaching. He has been in debates with the Sadducees and the Pharisees and the scribes and the chief priests. He's been teaching. And now, Mark tells us that he walks out of the temple. This is the last time Jesus is ever in the temple. He leaves the temple here, never to return. Now, this has great Old Testament symbolic meaning, right? This is an important thing to think about. Because when the first temple, in the form of the tabernacle, was created, God in his glory, which we call the Shekinah glory, which is really the glory of God that dwells with his people, descended upon the tabernacle. And wherever that glory would go, or the pillar of cloud would go, they would move the tabernacle, set it up, and the glory of God would come in to the Holy of Holies. So we see this happening for centuries. And then finally, the temple is built. Solomon built his temple, and it's dedicated to the Lord. And what happens? But the glory of God descends upon the temple, right? The glory of God resides in the Holy of Holies constantly. This is their hope. This is Israel's hope for the future, that we have the glory of God with us. Yet what we find out is in Ezekiel chapter 10, Ezekiel sees this vision, and the glory of God leaves the temple, never to return again, until Jesus is brought to the temple as a baby to be dedicated. And then the glory of God comes back, because we know that Jesus is the manifestation of God's glory. The writer of Hebrews tells us so in Hebrews 1:3. He says this: he is the radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of his nature. So when Jesus came into the temple, the glory of God came back to the temple again. And now, for the last time, Jesus leaves the temple. And this is the last time that the glory of God is ever found in the temple again. And he came out of the temple. And when this happens, one of his disciples said to him, look, teacher, what wonderful stones and what wonderful buildings. The disciples are in awe of the temple. The temple was massive. And at this time, this is Herod's temple, and it's not even complete yet. It doesn't get completed until around like 62 AD, another 30 or so years after this. So it's still under construction. But at this point, this is the most glorious building on earth. That was the thought. And it was most certainly the biggest building within hundreds of miles. Some of the stones that they would use, and I have no idea how they moved them around, but some of the stones were 40 feet long and 10 feet high. These stones were enormous. So if you could imagine the disciples walking out of the temple, looking at these massive stones, looking at this massive structure, and saying to Jesus, look at how amazing this is. I mean, in their minds, there's nothing on earth like this. And Jesus, in his typical fashion, kind of squashes that. He doesn't go into the awe of the building. In fact, what he says is something very different. Look at verse 2. Jesus said to him, do you see these great buildings? Yes, they are great buildings. There will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down. Do you see these great buildings? Yes, I see them. But do you see them? And do you realize that there will not be one stone left upon another? It's all going to come down. See, Jesus responds to the disciples' awe of the temple in what is called an apocalyptic pronouncement. Jesus shifts from being teacher, which is what they call him, to being a prophet. He speaks like a prophet. And then he goes out on the Mount of Olives and he begins to teach them. Now, when Jesus said this, more than likely the disciples would have been kind of taken back, maybe shocked, perhaps even embarrassed. What if somebody overheard what Jesus just said? I mean, such a statement is kind of ludicrous when you think about these massive stones and that they're all going to come down. This is their pride, not only nationally, but religiously. This is the temple. This is a big deal. And the disciples are proud of it. Perhaps they were even afraid because to utter such words against the temple was considered blasphemy. And you could be put to death for such statements. In fact, when the chief priests have Jesus on trial and they're charging him, they bring all these witnesses together who falsely accuse him, but what they say is, he said he was going to destroy the temple. This is actually the charge that led Jesus to the cross. This is a big statement. So as Jesus and his disciples left the temple, the disciples are wondering, what is this all about? What is this statement about? How can you say this? So they ask him, look at verse 3 and 4. And as he sat on the Mount of Olives, opposite the temple, this is to the east of the temple, Peter and James and John and Andrew ask him privately, probably because they don't want to make a big deal out of it. They say, tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the signs when all these things are about to be accomplished? So here we have the four disciples, very curious, wondering, why are you saying this, Jesus? We want to know about this because this is a really big deal. So they ask the question. They want to be prepared. Tell us, when is this going to happen? And what will be the signs? We can relate to this, right? We are likewise individuals that like to be prepared for anything. This is a great strategy in marketing, that our product will prepare you for this thing or the other. Do you remember when Y2K was a big threat, right? That all the computers were going to shut down in the year 2000 because they didn't understand the algorithm of going to a new millennium. And people prepared. They bought generators. Honda made a lot of money at Y2K selling their little generators. They would store water. We would store food, backup heaters. We'd have community strategies in case something bad happened. I had some friends that were loading up on guns and ammo and had bunkers in their backyard because they were sure that the world was about to end. We like to be prepared. We experience this oftentimes when there's some sort of terror attack that strikes close to home. Whether it's foreign terrorists or whether it's school shootings or something like that, there is this feeling of we have to be prepared. And that's what the big debate is around gun control, is how are we going to be prepared in these situations? How do we stop these situations from happening? We're looking to the future and trying to figure out how to move forward given the circumstances. And end times is another thing that gets people stirred up and wanting to be prepared. So the disciples likewise want to know, what are we to do? And oftentimes we have this mentality when it comes to the eschatology. How are we to prepare for the end? What happens when the apocalypse comes? What happens when the world is going to come to a close? How do we prepare ourselves? In fact, we have a family member that has written both his master's thesis and he's working on a dissertation on how to prepare in a worst-case scenario for the end of the world. We are people who like to be prepared, just like the disciples. Tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the signs when all these things are about to be accomplished? What Jesus tells them is his longest teaching in Mark's gospel. This is the longest discourse, the longest sermon. It is called the Olivet Discourse. Matthew 24 and Luke, I believe it's chapter 22, likewise has this sermon. The Olivet Discourse has been one of the center texts for some of the major end times or eschatology debates. Often as we go to the Olivet Discourse trying to figure out how we are to prepare or think about the future. This entire discourse is full of apocalyptic language echoing much of the Old Testament. And many assume that the Olivet Discourse is talking about the future of the world. So what we're going to do is we're going to spend this morning in the first part, verses 1 through 13 of the Olivet Discourse, and then in 2 weeks, we'll come back and finish the Olivet Discourse. So first, it's kind of like, when are these things going to happen? That's what we want to look at, the disciples' questions. When are these things going to happen? And then the second that we want to look at are, what are the signs? And Jesus speaks in all sort of cryptic, apocalyptic language, which is really fun and exciting when we see how it connects all throughout the Old Testament. So that will be in 2 weeks. But this morning, we want to focus in on verses 1 through 13 and try to begin to wrestle with the timing of this prophecy. So again, many assume that this sermon, this Olivet Discourse, is talking about the end of the world. In fact, this is the most popular view to hold. And it has been made popular through what is called dispensational theology, and most recently made very popular by the Left Behind series, the books and the movies. And we see kind of a continued excitement around different dates in the calendar, and somehow people get some media attention when they try to predict the end of the world. Right? And a lot of the study and a lot of the thinking comes back to Jesus' sermon on the Mount of Olives, this Olivet Discourse. So this view that it's speaking about the end of the world has prompted a doomsday sort of eschatology, a doomsday view of the end of the world, where the world will undergo some of the worst plagues and tribulations in human history, where demonic activity is at its highest, and Satan and his legions are unmasked, and they present themselves to the world seeking to rule mankind. So with this mentality in mind, when we come to verses in the Olivet Discourse, like 13:7, which says, "And when you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be alarmed. This must take place, but the end is not yet," we are trained to think that this is referring to the end of the world. That as we hear about more wars, we must be coming close to the end. Or when we read verse 8, "For nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places. There will be famines. These are but the beginning of the birth pains." I had a friend in Colorado who had an earthquake app on his phone. And every once in a while, he'd call me over and he'd pull up this app and he'd show me a map of the globe and where all the different earthquakes have been happening in the last 24 hours. And he would say, "Do you see how many earthquakes are happening? We are close to the end. We are there. We are at the precipice. We have to be prepared, right? We have to be prepared. We have to be ready for this to come to a close." It's because of verses like this, that earthquakes and famines will happen on earth near the end. Or perhaps in verse 12, it says, "And brother will deliver brother over to death, and the father his child, and children will rise against parents and have them put to death." When we read this verse, we think of martyrdom, Christians dying for their faith. The Center for the Study of Global Christianity estimates that more than 70 million Christians have been martyred in the last 2 millenniums, since the beginning of the church. 70 million. And over half of those 70 million, so over 35 million just in the 20th century. The 20th century is considered the bloodiest century in the history of the church. So we read a verse like this and we see these statistics that the martyrdom levels are sky high. We must be close to the end. Perhaps we read verse 19, which talks about tribulations, and we begin to think about the great tribulation that is coming, that we've heard about, that comes after the rapture, that 7-year period where essentially all hell breaks loose on earth. Where after God's people have been raptured away, God judges the earth through plagues and earthquakes and death and great tribulation. This view has been made popular by dispensational theologians such as John Nelson Darby, C.I. Scofield, Charles Ryrie, and again, made very popular by the Left Behind series. Or we read verses 24 and 25, but in those days, after that tribulation, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give light, and the stars will be falling from the heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. So we read this, and this fits into our imaginative view of what the end will be like. And then we go to the book of Revelation. We start trying to figure out, when is the Antichrist coming? What about the beast and the false prophet? When will they be revealed? What about the mark of the beast? What about one world currency? What about putting computer chips into our hands? What about the United States' role in the end of the world? We really begin to think through these things and try to wrestle with these things and say, how are we to be prepared for the future? You see, all these questions and speculations come from a very new and somewhat strange interpretation of the Bible. This sort of eschatology was completely void in the history of the church for the first 1,800 years. And to be honest, this sort of theology has done great damage to the mission of the church. Ideas don't exist in silos, right? Ideas affect other ideas, and ideas lead to action. So when we think about our theology or how we understand the Bible, that determines the mission of the church, all right? So ideas affect ideas, and ideas move to action. And then when we read the Bible, how we understand the Bible, the ideas of the Bible, that affects our mission. If you think that the world is essentially going to get worse and worse, and we're looking forward to getting off this demon-infested rock, then our mission is not going to be one that seeks to advance the kingdom of God. Our mission is not going to be one to proclaim that he rules and reigns forever and ever from his throne, as if that gives us any hope. In fact, what will tend to happen is our mission becomes more of just waiting for the rapture to happen and trying to save souls in the process, and we don't care about what's happening in the world around us. I went on a short-term, in the United States, missions trip with somebody, and there was a strong dichotomy between we are here to save souls. We can let the government and the liberal 501c3s feed the people. We can let them help them with their quality of life. What we are here for is to save souls. I say the Bible knows no such distinction. And the book of James illustrates this perfectly, right? You say you have faith, but if you're unwilling to even give your coat to your neighbor, your faith is useless. Your faith is dead. Your faith has no works. It is pointless, right? The Bible doesn't separate this world and our mission. It doesn't separate the saving of souls and the feeding and filling of bellies. The two are always together. God is concerned about all of you. Not all of you in this room, but every aspect of you. And all of you in this room. So as a church, our mission statement says this: Exodus Church exists for the redeeming, renewing, and restoring of all things to Christ. Now, we worked on this mission statement for a while, though it's only a few words. But we believe that this mission statement is good for us as a church because we believe it is the mission and vision of the Bible. It's the mission and vision of the Bible. Our vision is the vision of the Bible, that God is redeeming, renewing, and restoring all things to Christ. That all things will be brought into submission to King Jesus. That all things will be reconciled to Christ. We believe that when Jesus prays, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven, that prayer is being and will be answered. That our hope is not that we escape this depraved world and go to heaven, but our hope is that as the church advances by the power of the Spirit, that earth begins to look more like heaven, right? And this is the ultimate view that we see in the end of the Bible, in the book of Revelation, that heaven and earth are fused together. That is our hope. So, in other words, we have an optimistic view of the future, that God's kingdom will continue to advance on earth, and the gates of hell will not be able to stand up against its onslaught, right? We will knock those gates down, and we will bring the kingdom of God to every corner of the earth. And when that day is complete, when God has finished his work on earth, there will be representatives from every tribe, tongue, and nation singing praises to the Lamb. And we see this in Revelation 5 and in 7 as well. So if we hold this sort of view of the future, that things are actually working toward the advancement of God's kingdom, what do we do with passages like the Olivet Discourse that says things are going to get bad? They're going to get really bad. Well, it is chapters like this that actually give me great confidence that our future is not one of great tribulation, because the great tribulation spoken of here has already happened. It has already happened. So when we come to this chapter, we should be asking the same question that the disciples ask, right? So if we were to say, okay, let's try to view this chapter through these lenses, right? That God's kingdom is advancing, and that God is conquering, and that all things will be brought into submission to Christ, and that earth will begin to look more like heaven, though maybe not in our lifetime, maybe not in our children's lifetime, maybe it's another 10,000 years down the road before earth really begins to look more like heaven. But God has called every church to be faithful in moving that forward by his power and by the proclamation of his gospel. So if we were to view this chapter having that sort of hope before us, how should we understand the Olivet Discourse? Well, we should, again, be asking the question that the disciples ask of this chapter. Mark 13:4, tell us, when will these things be? This is a question we should ask. When will these things be? And what will be the sign when all these things are about to be accomplished? These are the questions that we should be asking of this text. And we should listen to Jesus for the answers, because he gives them to us. So what we find here, first, is their future is our past. All right? When the disciples are asking these questions, they are legitimately saying, when will these things take place? It is a future event for them. But for us, when we ask these questions, we should be looking back and say, oh, that's when it took place. It was in our past. So their future is our past. Clearly, the disciples have not yet experienced the signs nor the realities that Jesus says concerning the future. So for us, we must hear these words as the disciples heard these words. And to do this, we must remember context, right? So if we were in a Bible study, the first question, if someone says, hey, what do you think about this verse? The first question that should come up and say, that we should say is, well, what is the context? How does this verse, how does this word, how does this phrase fit into the flow of the Bible? So we must remember the context. So let's do that quickly. The context is this: Jesus and his disciples are walking out of the temple for the last time. They are in awe of the temple. They ask Jesus, what do you think? And Jesus says, I'm tearing it down. It's going to fall, right? The disciples are shocked. They walk out of the temple, they sit down, the disciples still wondering what's going on with that sort of apocalyptic pronouncement, come up to him and say, hey, when is this going to happen? So when is what going to happen? The whole context is referring to the temple, okay? The whole context of this chapter, of this sermon, has to do with the destruction of the temple. When the disciples ask about when these things will happen, they are not asking, nor are they thinking about the end of the world. It's not in their minds. They are referring to what Jesus said in regards to the temple. They are not saying, hey, when the world ends, what's that going to be like? No, when the temple ends, what is that going to be like? And Jesus gives them this answer. Now, we also have to realize the importance of the temple, right? Because the temple for them was their whole world. I mean, everything was revolved around the temple, and this is why it's such a big deal when they want to know, when is the temple going to end? In their minds, when is our world going to end? So in a sense, we want to see the temple as central to their world. Ancient Christian writers, actually, Josephus and others, wrote about Herod's temple and the magnitude and the beauty of it and how many parts of it had gold plated on the walls and so on. And I believe, well, I'm not going to say, well, I'll say it anyways. I might be wrong. I believe it was Herod who stood before his temple, and he pronounces that he has outdone Solomon, right? Solomon built the temple first, and when Herod finishes his temple, he stands there and says, surely, Solomon, I have outdone you, right? This is the most glorious thing on earth. And these ancient writers would talk about when the sun would hit the temple, the reflection off of the gold was so bright you couldn't even look at the temple. It was as if you're looking at the sun itself. This is a big deal to the people. If the temple goes away, there's no more priests. If there's no more priests, there's no more sacrifices. If there's no more sacrifices, there is no more forgiveness of sins. If we don't have forgiveness of sins, we are not in right relationship with God. If we're not in right relationship with God, we might as well be exiled and our world is over, right? The temple is a big deal to the people, to the disciples. And one of the beautiful themes in Revelation is that, or in the Bible, is this idea of creation and then decreation and then recreation, right? Or another way to think about it would be you have life, death, and resurrection, right? You have the old passes away so the new can come, right? These are patterns that we see all throughout the Bible, and we see these patterns in our own world as well. In fact, we experience it every day. When the sun goes down, it is like this death and then a resurrection in the morning, right? We go outside today, it's nice and warm. Last few days have been nice and warm. Spring is this idea of resurrection. That's why Easter is in the spring, because it is this resurrection. The grass turns green, the death is over, and new life is here. This is a theme throughout the Bible, and Jesus, I think, has this in mind in verse 8. When he says, for nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places. There will be famines. And then this right here. These are but the beginning of the birth pains. All right? This is just the beginning of the birth pains. So if there are birth pains, if the destruction of the temple and all the things that are going to happen around it are like birth pains, what is it that's being born? Right? What is it that's being born? And what we see, the great Christian hope, and even why we call ourselves born-again Christians, is because we're wrapped into this new birth, right? What's being born in Jesus is a new creation, a new covenant, a new kingdom. The old covenant is going away. It's dying, which is represented in the temple, and it has to go away so that the new can come. All right? So the birth pains is that God is giving birth to a new covenant. And when that happens, things begin to shift and shake, and things get difficult. They are real pains that take place. Another contextual verse to keep in mind would be to look at chapter 13, verse 30. This is near the end of the sermon as recorded in Mark, but it's all still the same sermon. He says, "Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place." All right? This generation is not going anywhere. This generation will not pass away until all these things take place. So here, Jesus is still in the same sermon, and therefore this passage cannot be talking about the end of the world. It just can't. If all of these things that he just said will take place before this generation passes away, he is not talking about our future, right? He was talking about the disciples' future, but our past. And again, in 2 weeks, we will look into this a little bit more. So, what time frame is Jesus talking about? If it's not our future, if it can't be our future, because of the fact that these are birth pains and something is being born, the new covenant, new creation, and that all these things will happen before this generation passes away, what is he talking about? What time frame? Well, the time frame he's talking about is between his prophetic announcement, right, when he says it's coming down, starting there and going to AD 70, where the temple is sacked by Rome and is destroyed. All right? And during that period of time, there was great tribulation. There was great suffering. There were earthquakes. There were many things that took place. In fact, all of these things, according to Jesus, takes place in that period of time. So let's think about the birth pains, if you would, as giving us a clue on when these things are going to happen. All right? And we have some of the birth pains laid out for us in verses 5 through 13. So let me read this passage. Starting in verse 4. Tell us, when will these things be? This is the question we must ask. And what will be the sign when all these things are about to be accomplished? And Jesus began to say to them, "See that no one leads you astray. Many will come in my name, saying, 'I am he,' and they will lead many astray. And when you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be alarmed. These must take place, but the end is not yet." Again, what is that end? It is the destruction of the temple. "For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places. There will be famines. These are but the beginning of the birth pains. But be on your guard, for they will deliver you over to councils, and you will be beaten in synagogues, and you will stand before governors and kings for my sake, to bear witness before them. And the gospel must be proclaimed to the nations. And when they bring you to trial and deliver you over, do not be anxious beforehand what you are going to say or what you are to say, but say whatever is given to you in that hour. For it is not you who speaks, but the Holy Spirit. And brother will deliver brother over to death, and father his child, and children will rise up against parents and have them put to death. And you will be hated by all for my name's sake. But for the one who endures to the end will be saved." So here are some of the birth pains that Jesus is talking about, that comes with the death of the old covenant and the birth of the new one. Again, as this sermon unfolds, there's more details and more imagery that help us understand this, and we'll look at that in a couple weeks. But verses 5 and 6 say this, "And Jesus began to say to them, 'See that no one leads you astray.'" Right? This is going to be a problem for you, disciples. This is going to be a problem for you, Peter, James, John, and Andrew, People are going to try to lead you astray. Jesus starts off by warning his disciples that whatever comes, be faithful. Then he kind of concludes that right in verse 13 when he says, the one who endures to the end will be saved. So don't be led astray, but endure. And everything in between is what you must endure and not be led astray within. So though this is contextual for their generation, these words are for us, right? I mean, Jesus says that many will come in his name saying, I am he, right? And we don't really worry that often when people come claiming to be Jesus, coming in the name of God as a prophet. Now, it still happens, but I think we've gotten to the point oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes where we say, there's something wrong with that, right? Someone claiming to be Jesus is not a good thing. You know, Jesus is worthy of all praise and affection and worship. You are not. However, we are led astray by making things worthy of our affections and love and worship. Right? I mean, somebody doesn't have to say, I am Jesus for us to worship. Right? At times it can be our technology, our cell phones. It can be a social media identity that we worship. Right? It could be our bank account. It could be pop stars. It could be movie stars. It could be bands. It could be cars. It could be hobbies. It could be kids. It could be spouse. It could be our home. Right? I mean, we are creatures made to worship. And as soon as we start worshiping something that is not Christ, we have been led astray. So likewise, we need to hear this warning. Do not be led astray. Do not be led astray. There's only one worthy of worship, and that is Jesus. Yet, in the disciples' day, many did come saying, I am Jesus. In fact, John speaks to this. John, who's sitting on the Mount of Olives with Jesus and hearing this warning, in 1 John 2:18 says this, children, it is the last hour. Okay, this is really cool too, because John is saying, okay, it is the last hour. It is about to happen. The end is about to come. Again, he's not talking about the end of the world. 1 John was written in the late 60s, very close to the destruction of the temple, saying this is the last hour. And as you have heard, that Antichrist is coming. So now, many Antichrists have come. Therefore, we know it's the last hour. John is connecting the two. I remember what Jesus said, that people will come saying, hey, I am he, and that's happened. It's happened multiple times. And there is this other guy that's claiming to be Christ, but he's an Antichrist, so don't worry about him. It's the last hour. It's about to happen. The old is about to go away so the new can be completely born. Jesus goes on in Mark 13:7 and 8. And when you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be alarmed. This must take place, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places. There will be famines. These are but the beginning of the birth pains. All of these things that happen, that Jesus prophesies or announces, took place. We see this in the New Testament writings and certainly in the Jewish histories of the early church, that earthquakes and famines and wars and rumors of wars. In fact, it was Rome, right, that came in and conquered Jerusalem and destroyed the temple. That's a war. We had nations rising up and battles going on. It was chaos in that first century. Chaos. The rest of the section goes on to talk about being delivered over to councils and being beaten in synagogues and standing before kings to bear witness for Jesus. And we find this happening time and time again in the book of Acts, right? The apostles coming and standing before leaders, testifying to Jesus. Paul getting beaten, Peter being beaten and arrested, right? We see betrayals taking place. All of these things are happening in the early church, in the ministry of the apostles, which we find, essentially, throughout the rest of the New Testament, right? These things are happening there. He's not talking about the end of the world. We're waiting for these things to happen. They happened. And then finally, he talks about being put on trial. He talks about families giving each other up because of the faith. And he talks about that you'll even be handed over to death. It's going to get so bad, it will be death. Whoops. That's all right. We'll keep going. So now you might think that now I really need a drink of water. Now that's gone. No, I'm just kidding. We might be thinking that the disciples are regretting asking this question, right? I mean, they go from, hey, look how great the temple is, to hearing Jesus say, it's not that great, it's going to fall. And then they say, well, tell us about that. Like, all right, well, this is what's going to happen, right? Your entire world will be overturned. There's going to be wars and famines and earthquakes, right? You'll be beaten for the gospel. You'll be put in jail for the gospel. You'll be put on trial for the gospel. You'll be betrayed by ones who love you, right? You will be hated for the gospel. You'll be put to death for the gospel. It's like the disciples are saying, man, I wish I didn't ask that question. That is not the news I was hoping for. I was hoping to be raptured out of here before that took place. This is rough news to hear. Yet, this calling that Jesus has put on their lives, first of all, we have to hear this calling is also true of us. And though we experience peace here, there are people today that do not experience this peace. But they can say, yeah, this is all true of me and my family, right? This is the life of the church. This is the posture in which we take. And you want to know what the wonderful thing is about this calling to come and die? The wonderful thing about this calling, as difficult as it may sound, is that Jesus has traveled this road before the disciples. He traveled this road before the Christian martyrs. And he has traveled this road before us. And he is calling us from the other side. Right? He's calling us from the other side, having already gone through these things. You see, Jesus didn't just lay out what it's going to look like for the disciples in the years to come before the fall of the temple, but he prophesied, once again, his own fate and the path that he would travel. Jesus was talking about what will lead up to the destruction of the temple in AD 70, but he was also talking about himself, the true temple, and what would lead up before that destruction. Jesus' predictions of the destruction of the temple foreshadow his own arrest, sufferings, and death. Look with me at verse 9. He says this, "But be on your guard, for they will deliver you over to councils, and you will be beaten in synagogues, and you will stand before governors and kings for my sake to bear witness before them." Jesus predicts that the Jews will deliver the apostles to courts. But you know what happens first? Jesus is delivered to courts. Jesus predicts that the disciples will be flogged in synagogues. But first, Jesus is flogged. Jesus warns that the disciples will stand before governors and kings to testify. But first, Jesus stands before Pilate, the governor, and King Herod, and he gives a testimony. Jesus warns that the disciples will be betrayed by family. But first, Jesus is betrayed by Judas, a member of his new family. In verse 19, Jesus predicts tribulation. And then he suffers the greatest tribulation, sorrow, and pain the world has ever seen. You see, Jesus never calls his people to walk through something that he has not already walked through himself. Hear that, right? He never calls his people to walk through anything that he has not already walked through himself. There is no pain, there's no anguish, there's no sorrow that Jesus calls you to bear that he has not bore himself. There's no stress that you cannot take to Jesus with complete confidence that he can bear it, because he already has. Jesus has taken the weight of our sorrow and pain. He has taken the weight of our guilt and our shame. And he has walked through the doors of death to come out on the other side, resurrected. And now he calls us, he beckons us to take up our crosses and follow him along that same path. He calls us to walk faithfully as he walked faithful. And each step he is forming us into the image of himself. He is creating for himself a people who live a cruciformed life. Peter Leithart says this: when you suffer, you're on the cross, where Jesus was. And that's where the living Jesus will meet you. You ask for relief, and he gives you more suffering. Not only to work these virtues into you, but to make you a living witness to your crucified Lord. By your patient, joyful, persevering, honest suffering, God demonstrates in your life that his power is made perfect in weakness. He makes your life a living witness to the power of the gospel. He proves in your life that the gospel is real. Man, how should our perspective of suffering be when it comes? And what hope do we have? That Jesus is resurrected. He's gone through it all, and he is now glorified on the other end. And he's calling us to himself, where we will share in that resurrection. And my friends, this cruciform life that he calls us to live, let's not have what I would imagine a response similar to the disciples, right? Let's not be weighed down by that. Let's not be afraid of that. For this is what he created us for. This cruciform life that he has called us to is the most righteous and glorious and peaceful and joyful and truthful and loving life we could possibly live. Because he's alive, right? And he reigns forever. And he's calling us to himself and forming us into the image of his Son. Let's pray.